Before the darkness came, the world still made sense. People woke with the sun, worked beneath it, and planned their lives around its predictable rise and fall. Seasons followed familiar rhythms. Crops were planted with confidence that warmth would return. Winters were harsh, but expected. Summers were brief, but reliable. Across continents, human societies were imperfect, unequal, and often violent, but stable enough to survive. No one living at the beginning of the 6th century believed they were standing on the edge of a planetary crisis, and that is what makes what followed so devastating. The early 6th century was not an age of chaos. It was a period of recovery and consolidation. In Europe and the Mediterranean, old imperial systems had weakened, but new political structures had taken their place. Trade routes still functioned. Cities still produced goods. Markets still gathered people together. In the East, large populations depended on agriculture, supported by long-standing irrigation systems. Seasonal rains and predictable temperatures allowed farming communities to survive year after year. In Asia, dynasties recorded the heavens carefully, tracking celestial movements and weather patterns as part of governance itself. In the Americas, civilizations thrived within delicate environmental balances, adapting their economies to coastlines, rivers, and mountain ranges. Human survival was fragile, but it was familiar. Then the sky changed. The first signs were subtle. Not storms, not earthquakes, not fire, just light behaving strangely. Daytime no longer felt bright. Shadows softened. The sun appeared pale, distant, almost sickly. People noticed that even at noon, the warmth they expected was missing. At first, this was confusing, not alarming. Cloudy days happened before. Dust storms were not unheard of. Seasonal haze came and went. But this did not pass. Weeks turned into months, and the sun did not recover. Across vast regions, daylight became muted. The world took on a permanent dusk. People described the sky as heavy, lifeless, drained of color. This was not localized weather. This was global. Communities separated by thousands of miles reported the same phenomenon, a sun that no longer delivered heat or clarity. Without understanding atmospheric science, people searched for meaning in religion, superstition, and fear. Some believed the world was ending. Others believed divine punishment had arrived. Most simply tried to survive. Plants were the first victims. Crops rely on light more than people realize. Without sufficient sunlight, photosynthesis slows. Growth stalls. Fruit fails to mature. Grain heads remain thin and empty. Fields that should have been green turned weak and brittle. Farmers waited and waited. But warmth did not come. Instead, cold lingered. Frost appeared where it had never appeared before. Growing seasons shortened dramatically. In some regions, summer felt like an extension of winter. Food shortages followed quickly. Agricultural failure does not announce itself loudly. It creeps. At first, yields are slightly lower. Then reserves are consumed earlier than expected. Then prices rise. Finally, hunger appears. Families began rationing food. Governments struggled to maintain supply chains. Trade slowed as surplus disappeared. What made this collapse worse was its timing. This was not a single failed harvest. The abnormal conditions repeated. Year after year. When food becomes scarce, societies fracture. People migrate. Borders tighten. Conflicts ignite. But famine does something else too. It weakens the human body. Malnutrition erodes immune systems. Even minor infections become deadly. Wounds heal slowly. Energy disappears. The population became vulnerable not to one threat, but to many, and the world was about to face another catastrophe. Disease does not require chaos to spread. It requires opportunity. Crowded cities, weakened bodies, trade routes. As environmental stress continued, illness began to appear in clusters. What followed would become one of the most destructive disease outbreaks in recorded history. But at the time, no one understood what they were facing, only that people were dying quickly and in great numbers. While Europe struggled with famine and disease, other regions experienced their own disasters. In East Asia, weather patterns turned unpredictable. Dust fell from the sky in quantities never recorded before. Frost arrived during warm months. Snow appeared when it should not exist at all. Entire agricultural systems collapsed. Populations dropped sharply in certain regions. In some areas, entire communities disappeared from records altogether. The same year, the same darkness, the same cold. This was no coincidence. Modern science would eventually reveal that the planet itself had been pushed into a state of imbalance. Volcanic forces, operating far beyond human awareness, had reshaped Earth's atmosphere. Ash and sulfur particles had reached the upper sky, spreading across hemispheres and blocking sunlight on a scale rarely seen. The result was a planetary chain reaction: lower temperatures, unstable weather, failed harvests, weakened populations, exploding disease, all triggered by events no human had witnessed directly. But the people of that time did not know any of this. They did not know the cause. They did not know the duration. They did not know if the sun would ever return to normal. They lived day to day under a sky that no longer behaved like a sky. And the psychological toll was immense. Imagine waking every morning beneath a dim, cold light, watching crops fail, hearing of sickness spreading without explanation. Hope became fragile. Fear became constant. This was not the worst year because of violence. It was the worst year because of uncertainty, because survival itself felt unreliable, and because the disaster did not end quickly. It stretched on. In the next part, we will move deeper into the moment the world realized this was not temporary. When communities understood that the sky itself had changed, and that normal life was no longer guaranteed. When the sky stopped working, at first, people tried to convince themselves that nothing was wrong. Weather had always been unpredictable. Cloudy seasons came and went. Cold summers had happened before, at least in living memory. So when daylight felt weaker than usual, most assumed it would pass. They waited. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months, and the light never fully returned. The sky did not darken suddenly, like during an eclipse. There was no dramatic moment when people pointed upward and gasped. Instead, the world slipped slowly into something unfamiliar. Morning arrived later. Even at midday, brightness felt diluted. Shadows softened, then nearly vanished. Colors looked washed out, as if the world had been drained of contrast. The sun was still visible, but it no longer behaved like a sun. In many regions, people described daylight as cold and lifeless. The warmth that usually accompanied clear skies was gone. Standing under open air no longer felt comforting. It felt wrong. And because the change was gradual, confusion spread faster than panic. Farmers continued planting. Merchants continued trading. Leaders continued governing. Everyone assumed normalcy would return on its own. It didn't. As the months passed, a pattern emerged. No matter the season, the sky remained muted. No matter the location, temperatures stayed low. In areas that depended on predictable warmth, this was disastrous. Seeds sprouted weakly, if at all. Fruit trees bloomed late, or not at all. Grain heads failed to develop properly. Harvests shrank across entire regions, not just in one place, everywhere. Agriculture is unforgiving. Crops don't negotiate. They don't adapt quickly. When conditions shift even slightly, the consequences multiply. By the time people realized how serious the situation had become, it was already too late to change course. Fields stood thin and brittle. Storage reserves emptied faster than expected. Food prices climbed beyond reach. What made this crisis especially brutal was its timing. This wasn't happening after a war or following political collapse. This was happening during what should have been a stable period. Society wasn't prepared for a shock of this scale. As food grew scarce, the effects rippled outward. Rural communities were hit first. When harvests failed, families had nothing to fall back on. People began leaving their land, searching for food in towns and cities, but cities were no safer. Urban centers depended on rural surplus. When the countryside failed, cities followed. Markets emptied. Rations shrank. Crowded living conditions worsened. Hunger spread silently. And hunger changes behavior. People hoard. They migrate. They fight over resources. Social order weakens not because people become violent, but because survival demands priority. Laws lose power when bodies are starving. Trust erodes. While famine tightened its grip, the cold refused to release its hold. Winters felt longer. Summers felt shorter. In some regions, frost appeared during months that should have been warm. The land no longer followed familiar rhythms. For farming societies, this was terrifying. Because agriculture isn't just food, it's time, planting schedules, harvest cycles, generational knowledge. When climate breaks those patterns, experience becomes useless. People realized they were facing something unprecedented. Across continents, observers recorded the same unsettling truth. The sky itself had changed. Not locally, not temporarily, globally. The world felt quieter, heavier, colder, and no one could explain why. Without understanding atmospheric processes, people turned inward. Some believed divine punishment had arrived. Others feared the world was ending. In many cultures, unusual skies were associated with disaster, and now disaster was everywhere. The psychological toll was immense. Fear spread faster than any disease. But disease was coming too. When bodies weaken from hunger, they lose resistance. Infections that would normally be survivable become deadly. Crowded living conditions accelerate transmission. Trade routes carry illness across vast distances. And with populations already stressed, disease finds fertile ground. Illness began appearing in clusters. At first, it looked like many outbreaks before it. Then mortality surged. Entire households vanished. Cities struggled to manage the dead. Daily life became organized around loss. And this was only the beginning. While Europe and the Mediterranean struggled with famine and disease, other regions experienced their own nightmares. In East Asia, historical records describe strange atmospheric events. Fine particles fell from the sky. The air felt thick and unnatural. Visibility dropped. In some areas, cold arrived during what should have been warm months. Snow appeared when it had no business appearing. Crops were destroyed before they could mature. Entire populations faced starvation. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Different cultures, different continents, same crisis. This was not a regional disaster. It was planetary. But again, no one living through it could see the full picture. They only knew their own suffering, and they had no reason to believe it would ever end. What makes this period uniquely horrifying is not just the scale of suffering, it's the absence of answers. No explanation, no timeline, no reassurance. People lived under a sky that no longer behaved like a sky, under seasons that no longer followed rules, under a future that felt unreliable. This was the moment humanity realized something fundamental. The natural systems that supported life could fail, not because of human action, not because of war, but because of forces beyond observation. In the next part, we will examine how this environmental collapse triggered one of the deadliest biological disasters in history, and why weakened societies were unable to stop it. Because once the sky stopped working, the human body followed. When bodies began to fail, by the time hunger had taken hold, societies were already operating at their limits. Food shortages do not kill instantly. They weaken first. Muscles lose strength. Wounds heal slowly. Fatigue becomes constant. And most importantly, the immune system collapses. For the human body, starvation is not just the absence of food. It is the breakdown of defense. This was the condition much of the world found itself in after years of dim skies and failed harvests. Populations were still standing, but they were vulnerable, and vulnerability invites disease. Illness had always existed, but during this period, it behaved differently. It spread faster, it killed more efficiently, and it overwhelmed systems that had managed health and burial for generations. Communities began reporting sudden outbreaks. At first, they seemed local. A city here, a region there. Then patterns emerged. Trade routes connected outbreaks. Ports became points of transmission. Crowded living spaces accelerated spread. What followed would later be recognized as one of the most destructive pandemics ever recorded. But at the time, it had no name, only symptoms. People developed swelling. Pain intensified rapidly. Movement became impossible. Fever burned through already weakened bodies. Death followed quickly. In some areas, the dead outnumbered the living, and there was no understanding of contagion. People did not isolate. They did not quarantine. They cared for the sick as best they could, often infecting themselves in the process. Cities filled with the sounds of mourning. As fatalities mounted, social systems broke down. Burial practices collapsed under the sheer number of deaths. Bodies remained uncollected. Public spaces became unsafe. The psychological impact was devastating. Survivors were forced to confront death daily. Fear replaced routine. Trust eroded. Disease does not just kill people, it kills order. When laborers die, infrastructure fails. When officials die, governance weakens. When healers die, hope disappears. Entire professions vanished in months. In some regions, farming ceased altogether, not because land was unusable, but because there was no one left to work it. While the disease spread across densely populated regions, famine continued to tighten its grip. The weakened survived long enough to become infected. The infected survived long enough to spread illness. It was a feedback loop of collapse. At the same time, the climate showed no signs of recovery. The sky remained dull. Temperatures stayed low. This prolonged stress meant that even regions spared the worst disease effects struggled to recover. There was no surplus, no rebound harvest, just endurance. In many places, populations responded by moving. Families abandoned villages. Groups migrated toward regions rumored to have food. But migration introduced new problems. Travelers carried disease. Refugees strained already fragile communities. Borders hardened. Violence increased not out of cruelty, but desperation. Political structures could not escape the consequences. States rely on taxation, labor, and stability. All three collapsed. Revenue disappeared as trade declined. Armies weakened as soldiers fell ill or starved. Rebellions ignited in regions where authority could no longer provide protection. The environmental disaster had transformed into a social one. Yet even in collapse, human beings adapted. Some communities reduced contact with outsiders. Others changed burial practices. Some turned to local subsistence methods rather than centralized distribution. These adaptations saved lives, but not quickly enough to stop widespread loss. Meanwhile, regions far from one another recorded eerily similar experiences. Cold seasons extended unexpectedly. Weather patterns behaved erratically. Food systems failed in ways no one remembered. This parallel suffering confirmed something profound. The crisis was not cultural. It was planetary. What made this era especially frightening was the absence of visible cause. No invading army, no obvious natural disaster. The sun still rose, just weakly. The land still existed, just unproductive. The enemy was invisible, and that invisibility made fear uncontrollable. Some believed the world had been cursed. Others believed divine judgment had arrived. Many simply stopped asking why. When survival becomes the only concern, explanation loses priority. Over time, the disease burned through populations. Like all outbreaks, it eventually slowed not because it was defeated, but because it ran out of hosts. The dead were too many, the living too few. Communities emerged smaller, quieter, and deeply altered. But the damage did not end with the disease itself. The demographic collapse reshaped everything. Labor shortages changed economies. Land ownership shifted. Power structures weakened permanently. The world after this crisis was not the same as the world before it. And yet, the climate had still not stabilized. Cold conditions persisted. Agriculture remained unreliable. Recovery would not be swift. It would take generations. This was the moment when societies realized something deeply unsettling. The disasters they faced were not isolated. They were connected. A chain reaction had been triggered, one that moved from sky to soil, from soil to body, and from body to civilization. In the final part, we will step back and examine the full picture. What caused this planetary breakdown? How science later uncovered the hidden trigger? And why this period stands apart from every other bad year in human history. Because what happened was not just tragedy, it was transformation. Why this year changed everything. By the time the worst effects began to fade, the world that emerged was no longer the world that had entered the crisis. The skies slowly brightened. Temperatures began to recover. Harvests cautiously returned. But the damage had already been done. What made this period different from other disasters in history was not just suffering, it was duration. This was not a single bad season, not a short war, not a brief outbreak. This was a chain reaction that unfolded over many years, reinforcing itself again and again. And because of that, its consequences reached far beyond the people who first experienced it. Long after the skies cleared, societies struggled to rebuild. Population losses meant fewer workers. Fewer workers meant lower production. Lower production meant weaker states. Power structures that had existed for centuries fractured under pressure. Some never recovered. Political authority became harder to maintain. Trade networks shrank. Cities lost influence as people turned inward, relying on local survival instead of distant systems. The idea of centralized stability weakened, not everywhere at once, but steadily. One of the most important outcomes of this era was a shift in how people related to the natural world. Before this crisis, nature was dangerous but predictable. Seasons followed rules. Weather patterns made sense. Afterward, certainty was gone. Communities realized that survival depended not just on planning, but on adaptation. Flexibility became more valuable than tradition. This shift would quietly shape the centuries that followed. For a long time, historians struggled to understand why this period felt so disruptive. Written records existed, but they were fragmented. Many regions experienced collapse without recording the cause. Others recorded symptoms without explanation. It wasn't until modern science entered the picture that clarity emerged. Ice cores drilled from glaciers revealed thin, dark layers trapped deep within frozen time. Those layers told a story. They showed that massive amounts of volcanic material had entered the atmosphere during this period. Not once, but multiple times. Ash and sulfur particles had spread across the planet, reflecting sunlight away from the surface. This explained the dim skies, the prolonged cold, the agricultural collapse. Tree rings confirmed the same story. Growth slowed dramatically during these years, indicating environmental stress. Independent evidence from different continents aligned. The planet itself had recorded the disaster. What makes this realization so unsettling is its implication. This was not a human-made catastrophe. No empire caused it. No army triggered it. No single decision led to collapse. The disaster came from deep within the earth, invisible, uncontrollable, and unstoppable once it began. This is why historians and scientists often point to this period as uniquely destructive, not because it featured the most violence, but because it removed the foundation on which societies depended. When food systems fail, everything fails. Law, order, culture, and progress all depend on survival first. Without food, nothing else matters. As conditions stabilized, humanity did what it always does. It adapted. New farming techniques emerged. Communities became more localized. Trade slowly reconnected. But the memory of instability lingered. People carried forward an understanding, sometimes conscious, sometimes not, that the world could change without warning. This awareness shaped belief systems, governance, and even art. Centuries later, this era would be remembered indirectly, not as a single-named disaster, but as a turning point, a moment when the trajectory of history subtly shifted. Empires that might have expanded instead consolidated. Technological progress slowed in some regions and accelerated in others. The map of the world did not change overnight, but its future did. So what makes this year stand apart from every other terrible year? It wasn't just famine. It wasn't just disease. It wasn't just climate. It was all of them at once, feeding into each other. A failure of light led to a failure of crops. A failure of crops led to hunger. Hunger led to disease. Disease weakened societies. Weakened societies struggled to recover. A perfect storm without a storm. And unlike wars or political collapse, there was no enemy to defeat. No peace treaty to sign. People had to wait. And waiting, without knowing how long, was its own form of suffering. This is why modern researchers often hesitate to call it simply the worst year, because its impact cannot be confined to 12 months. It was the beginning of a long, grinding era of instability, a slow-burning crisis that reshaped the human world. There is also a lesson hidden here, one that feels especially relevant today. Human civilization depends on systems we rarely think about: climate, agriculture, ecological balance. When those systems are stable, society feels strong. When they fail, everything else becomes fragile. The people who lived through this period did not know they were part of a global catastrophe. They did not know why the sky dimmed. They did not know when it would end. They did not know what future awaited them. They only knew that the world they trusted had changed, and that survival could no longer be taken for granted. If you had lived during this time, you wouldn't have marked the calendar and said, "This is the worst year to be alive." You would have said something much simpler. Something like, "Nothing feels normal anymore." That is why this year stands apart in history. Not because it was dramatic, but because it quietly removed the certainty people depended on most. The certainty that tomorrow would resemble today. And when that certainty disappears, history changes direction. The past often feels distant, but its lessons are close. This story is not just about one terrible year long ago. It's about how fragile stability can be and how resilient humanity must become. Because history doesn't always announce its turning points. Sometimes, the world simply grows darker, and life goes on anyway.